Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today, we're going to be taking a look at 1978,
Okay.
a year that really sticks out in crime history. It just seems unbelievable how many serial killers were active during this time.
It's true, 1978 was a pivotal year.
Right.
It was the end of the line for some notorious figures and, unfortunately, the start for others.
Yeah, the number of active serial killers had exploded by that point.
Mm-hmm.
Radford University has some data showing just how drastically things changed.
Right.
There were about 100 active serial killers in the 1940s. That went up to 113 in the 50s, then jumped to 293 in the 60s.
Wow.
And then in the 1970s,
Yeah.
there were 765. That's a huge increase.
It's a significant jump, and it wasn't just the raw numbers either.
Right.
The media was really starting to focus on serial killers, which likely fueled public fascination and perhaps even gave some twisted individuals the idea to commit copycat crimes.
So let's get into some of the specific cases from that year.
Okay.
We're talking infamous names here.
Mm-hmm.
Ted Bundy, for instance, was finally captured in 1978
Right?
after claiming his last 3 victims. His reign of terror lasted 7 years and resulted in over 30 victims.
It was a long time coming.
Do you think his capture brought any sense of relief to the public?
Absolutely. Bundy's capture was a significant moment, but remember, 1978 also saw the emergence of other terrifying figures.
Right.
Carlton Gary, the stocking strangler, was active in Georgia until his arrest that same year.
Oh, wow.
His crimes, mostly targeting elderly women, really gripped the community.
And how can we forget the Hillside Stranglers?
Oh, yeah.
They committed their 10th and final murder in 1978.
Right.
They were eventually caught, but for a while they really had Los Angeles on edge.
Another case that shocked the nation was the arrest of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. When they searched his property, they found the bodies of over 30 young men and boys buried beneath his house.
And as if all of that wasn't enough, 1978 was also the year Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. He would, of course, go on to become one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. It's almost like a breeding ground for these figures.
And it wasn't just in the U.S. either.
Oh, really?
Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, began his horrifying spree in 1978,
Wow.
eventually killing over 50 people in the Soviet Union.
Goodness.
And in Britain, Dennis Nilsen started his series of murders, ultimately becoming one of the UK's most prolific serial killers.
We also can't forget cases like the Connecticut River Valley Killer, who began his series of murders in 1978. These cases, some still unsolved, remind us how pervasive this problem was at the time.
There are so many other names from that year. Gerald Parker, known as the Orange County Killer, who murdered 5 of his 6 victims in 1978.
Oh, wow.
And Philip Karl Jablonski, who claimed his first victim out of the 5 he would eventually kill. It truly was a dark period.
And then there's the truly unsettling story of Rodney Alcala.
Yeah.
In 1978, while he had already killed 4 women and served time for child molestation, he appeared on The Dating Game.
It's remarkable and disturbing that he actually won the date. Luckily, the woman who chose him decided not to go out with him, unknowingly avoiding a potentially fatal situation.
Wow.
Later, Alcala would claim to have murdered somewhere between 50 and 100 women.
Oh, my.
His case really highlights how these individuals could blend into society, making them even more dangerous.
But 1978 wasn't just about serial killers.
Yeah.
It also saw the rise of other forms of violence. Ted Kaczynski began his bombing campaign that year.
And then there's the Jonestown Massacre, orchestrated by cult leader Jim Jones,
Right?
where over 900 people died in a mass suicide.
It was a truly horrific event.
Yeah.
So why was 1978 such a breeding ground for violence?
Oh, there's no easy answer. It was a perfect storm of factors at play.
Right.
One theory is the lasting impact of war. World War II, and the Vietnam War in particular, likely left many men psychologically scarred.
That makes sense at the time. PTSD wasn't widely recognized or understood.
Right.
Many veterans had to deal with their trauma in silence without proper support.
Exactly. This lack of understanding and support could have led to increased aggression and detachment,
Right.
perhaps even contributing to the rise in serial killings.
And we can't forget the development of the interstate highway system around this time.
Yeah.
It made it much easier to travel long distances quickly and anonymously, which might have helped drifter serial killers operate and evade capture.
The highway system definitely played a role.
Yeah,
Before, it was much harder for these killers to move around so freely.
I see.
It's a good example of how societal changes can have unintended consequences.
Another theory that comes up is the role of the media.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of media attention on serial killers during this period.
Yeah.
Some experts think this intense coverage and public fascination might have inspired copycats, individuals seeking notoriety or driven by similar dark impulses.
That's a very real possibility.
Right.
The idea of if they can do it, so can I is a dangerous and disturbing phenomenon.
We also need to think about the influence of pop culture.
Okay.
True crime and detective magazines were really popular during this time, and some of them had pretty dark and sensationalized content.
Some people argue that exposure to this kind of material, especially at a young age, could desensitize individuals to violence or even spark unhealthy fascinations.
Right.
It's a complex issue, but definitely something to consider, especially when we think about the potential influence of violent media today.
Right.
What we consume shapes our understanding of the world, and that includes our perceptions of violence.
And then there are the societal changes that were happening.
Mm-hmm.
The 1970s saw a big increase in divorce rates,
Yeah.
which could have contributed to a sense of instability and family breakdown.
That's an important point. A lack of stable family structures has been linked to criminal behavior,
Right.
and that includes violent crimes.
Some researchers even point to the lead theory as a possible factor.
Okay.
This theory suggests that exposure to leaded gasoline, which was widely used back then, could have led to increased aggression and violent crime.
Interesting.
It's a controversial theory, but raises some interesting questions.
The lid theory is certainly intriguing.
Yeah.
There's some evidence to support it, but it's still being debated.
Right.
It does highlight how environmental factors can potentially impact behavior in ways we might not expect.
It seems like so many different things were coming together to create this perfect storm in 1978.
It was definitely a confluence of social, cultural, and perhaps even environmental factors.
Yeah.
It's crucial to remember that we can analyze and theorize,
Right.
but there may never be a definitive answer as to why 1978 saw such a surge in serial killer activity. However, understanding these potential contributing factors helps us understand the complexities of criminal behavior and the societal context that can influence it.
It's a reminder that even in times that some might consider golden, there can be dark undercurrents we can't ignore. So while 1978 might seem like a distant memory, the lessons we can learn from that era are still relevant today.
Absolutely. By understanding the past, we can better navigate the present and maybe even prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future.
And sometimes those answers or even just clues can come from those who were closest to these cases.
It's like trying to piece together a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Yeah.
We can see the bigger picture, this surge in serial killer activity,
Right.
but understanding all the individual factors and how they connect is a constant challenge.
You mentioned the highway system earlier.
Yeah.
How it might have aided drifter serial killers.
Right.
Were there any particular cases where that connection was really clear?
Ted Bundy is a prime example.
Yeah.
He used the expanding highway system to travel between states committing murders across a vast area.
Right.
His ability to move quickly and blend in made him incredibly difficult to track. It was like he was always one step ahead of law enforcement.
That must have added to the terror surrounding his case, knowing he could be almost anywhere.
Absolutely. It created a sense of widespread fear and uncertainty.
Right.
But his case also raises questions about the law enforcement response at the time. Communication between different jurisdictions was often slow and inefficient, which allowed him to continue his spree for much longer.
It's fascinating how something intended to connect the country could also be exploited in such a dark way.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how even positive changes can have unintended consequences.
And it highlights the importance of adaptation.
Right.
Law enforcement had to learn to adapt to this new reality of mobile predators, sharing information more effectively and developing new investigative techniques.
Yeah.
It was a learning curve for everyone.
You mentioned the media's role in potentially inspiring copycats.
Right.
Do you think that was a significant factor in 1978? It feels like there's always been a morbid fascination with true crime.
The difference in 1978 was the scale and intensity of media coverage.
Okay.
Serial killers were becoming almost like boogeymen in the public imagination. Their stories were sensationalized, their faces plastered on magazine covers.
Yeah.
It created this feedback loop where the more coverage they got, the more notorious they became, which potentially drew in others seeking the same level of infamy.
And those true crime magazines, some of which were pretty graphic, might have played a role in desensitizing certain individuals to violence.
Yeah.
Even normalizing it in some ways.
Exactly. It's a complex issue, and I don't think we can say for certain what impact those magazines had.
Right.
But it's certainly worth considering, especially when we think about the potential influence of violent media today.
Yeah.
What we consume shapes our understanding of the world,
Right.
and that includes our perceptions of violence.
Speaking of societal influences, we mentioned the rising divorce rates and the breakdown of traditional family structures during that period.
Hmm.
Do you think that played a role in the surge in serial killer activity?
There's a lot of debate about this,
Okay.
but some researchers suggest a correlation between family instability and criminal behavior.
Yeah.
It's not a simple cause and effect relationship, of course,
Right.
but a lack of stable support systems, especially during formative years, can impact development and potentially increase the risk of engaging in risky or harmful behavior.
It makes sense when those foundational support systems are shaky.
Yeah.
It can create a ripple effect that impacts individuals and, by extension, society as a whole.
Right.
And then there's the lead theory, which connects exposure to leaded gasoline with increased aggression and violence.
Mm-hmm.
That one seems a little more out there, but is there any evidence to support it?
It is controversial, but there have been studies showing a correlation between lead exposure, particularly in childhood, and increased aggression, impulsivity, and even criminal behavior later in life.
Okay.
Lead can affect brain development, and these effects can be long-lasting.
So while it might not be the sole explanation for the rise in serial killers, it could have been one piece of that larger puzzle we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that environmental factors can have a profound impact on behavior, sometimes in ways we don't fully understand.
We're all interconnected, and that seemingly disparate factors can converge to create complex outcomes.
Right.
We can't look at these issues in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
We have to consider the interplay of individual psychology, social dynamics, environmental influences, and even historical context.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
It seems like there's still so much we're trying to understand about what makes a serial killer and why 1978 was such a pivotal year for this type of crime.
We may never have all the answers, but the pursuit of understanding is essential.
Yeah.
It's how we learn, how we adapt, and hopefully how we can prevent such dark chapters from repeating themselves.
And sometimes those answers, or even just clues, can come from those who were closest to these cases.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you wonder what it was like for those on the front lines,
Yeah.
dealing with these cases day in and day out.
It must have been incredibly challenging, both professionally and emotionally.
Yeah.
Imagine the pressure of trying to catch these individuals knowing the stakes were so high,
Right. Yeah.
while also dealing with the horrific nature of the crimes themselves.
Yeah.
It takes a toll.
And I imagine there was a lot less awareness of the psychological impact this kind of work can have.
Oh, absolutely.
They weren't just dealing with the immediate threat, but also the potential for long-term trauma.
The concept of vicarious trauma,
Right.
the emotional residue that investigators can absorb from exposure to violence and suffering, wasn't widely understood back then. They were expected to just push through it.
Right.
Which could lead to burnout, compassion fatigue, and other mental health issues.
It's a reminder that even those tasked with protecting us are vulnerable, especially when facing such darkness.
For sure.
It's crucial to acknowledge the sacrifices they make and ensure they have the support they need.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Their well-being is essential,
Right.
not just for their own sake, but for the effectiveness of their work.
Right.
A traumatized investigator can't function at their best.
Yeah.
And that can compromise investigations and potentially put more lives at risk.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of these crimes,
Mm-hmm.
a cost that extends far beyond the immediate victims.
It's a ripple effect that touches families, communities, and those dedicated to seeking justice.
Right.
We often focus on the perpetrators, trying to understand their motivations and actions.
Yeah.
But it's equally important to acknowledge the impact on those working tirelessly to stop them.
Speaking of those who've dedicated their life to understanding these cases,
Right.
it's crucial to learn from their experiences,
Yeah.
to glean insights that can help us prevent future tragedies.
Exactly.
Tom Wood has spoken about this era as being the most violent in living memory.
He was involved in the investigation of 3 serial killers during this period, so it will be interesting to hear what he has to say in the weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.